I'm Grady Colleen in the CapeCod.com News Center, joined today by a special guest from the Hollywood sphere of Cape Cod. Do you mind just introducing yourself for our listeners?
Or reintroducing myself. I'm Casey Sherman, and I'm back here to share some more stories with you, Grady.
Yeah, it's awesome. Obviously, you're a returning face. There's been a lot of stuff going on, from things involving possible productions in Provincetown with one of your projects to delving into live theater. There's a lot of stuff I wanted to chat with you about today. But first and foremost, you've recently been featured in a lovely article, and I just kind of wanted to touch on that before we got any deeper. Do you mind just you brought in the prop for us on video today, but what's been going on?
Yeah, so I've got a new article out. It's a true crime expose in Boston Magazine, telling the story about a man that's been spending 43 years in a Massachusetts prison for a gangland murder that he did not commit. His name is Jimmy Rodwell. He's 68 years old right now, and he was convicted in 1980 in a brutal murder in Somerville, Massachusetts. Basically, it was a drug deal gone bad, and he was picked out of the blue. It became a cold case for a couple of years before state police and a couple of other entities, focused on this guy out of nowhere, arrested him. And he always thought it was a case of mistaken identity, that any day somebody would understand that mistake and let him go. But they put him in jail. They kept him in jail. Then they put him on trial, and he was convicted. And the really shocking thing here, too, is he was convicted really solely based on the testimony of two people, and they're what we call serial snitches in law enforcement. So basically, prisoners who are looking to shave time off of their own sentences would go testify at any trial that law enforcement wanted them to and say anything that law enforcement wanted them to say. And that, was the case with Jimmy Rodwell. And over the past, 43 years, so many prominent attorneys have raised the real issues of his innocence toward the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But that case has always been deflected. Nobody's already, given the effort to really look at it, because then it becomes, okay, you've got these legislators, these law enforcement detectives, or even judges who have all made their careers based on the conviction of Jimmy Rodwell and others. So they're protecting their own reputations after a while. I mean, we're seeing this unfold right now with the Karen Reed case. And as I mentioned, to people when I talk about this case, if you're really upset about the Karen Reed case, take a look at what they've been doing to Jimmy Rodwell for 43 years now.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is, of course, something that we've, I watch crime shows and stuff like that immediately. Like DNA comes to mind, but this was just before the advent of any of that. Really.
Just before the advent of DNA, which is unfortunate because this was a very close contact murder. So the likelihood that the victim in this case might have gleaned some DNA from his attacker is probably pretty high. Mm-hmm. But again, back in the 1970s, the murder happened in 1978, and I'll just give you a snapshot of what law enforcement protocol was at that time. The victim was killed in his car, and when law enforcement got to the scene, they actually towed the vehicle away from the crime scene with the victim's body still in it. It sounds ludicrous and absolutely silly, but that's what they did back then.
Yeah. So how did you get in touch? How did you learn about this case? What was the spark for you that made you feel like you had to chase this down? What was it for you?
Well, as you know, I get a lot of calls and emails and texts from people that all want me to take a look at, a crime that was committed, whether it's to bring closure and justice for a victim's family, or whether it's to focus on somebody who may or may not have been wrongfully convicted. I always pay attention to all these inquiries, but, they have to reach that level of for me to get involved. So I spent some time with Jimmy Rodwell at Concord State Prison a year ago. And Concord State Prison at the time was the oldest prison in Massachusetts. It's actually been shuttered. So Jimmy Rodwell remains behind bars, yet the prison that he's been in for well over 3 decades is now closed. So they've had to move Jimmy to a facility in Gardner, Massachusetts now. But I stared into Jimmy's eyes and I realized that this guy was telling the truth. And that truth was backed up by thousands of documents that I've poured over reviewed with the assistance of Jimmy's attorneys. Marty Weinberg, who's a very successful and prominent defense attorney in Boston, is just amazing, and he's got some other attorneys as well that have been incredibly helpful. To his plea for innocence, but they're always shouting at the wind and beating their heads against the wall. It might take somebody like me with the pedigree of several New York Times best-selling books and a lot of focus on the work that I do to get more interest in his case.
Mm-hmm. So what's next for him at this point? Have you been in touch recently? Do you think the next steps for him are? And essentially, what are you kind of hoping to get out of this in terms of results?
Well, the result, I want him to walk out of jail sooner rather than later. His attorney, Veronica White, who's really the day-to-day attorney on this case, and Jimmy calls her, the pit bull in a skirt, meaning she has dogged this case for so long, and she's right at the 11th hour. Jimmy is, as I said, he's 68 years old. He's got one more bid for a new trial until those bids are, null and void. We're working to get him a new trial, the 8th trial for him, but also we're working on clemency finally from the state of Massachusetts, because now somebody who's been convicted of a crime can get clemency without accepting responsibility for that crime. Jimmy probably could have walked out of jail several times over the past 43 years had he accepted responsibility for that, but he wouldn't because he's innocent.
An interesting dilemma from the internal moral point of view as well.
I don't know if I could have done that, seeing what life is like for him every single day and knowing that, well, if I said this, even though it was untrue, at least I'd be able to spend a few years with my family, free from the shackles of the prison system. But, Jimmy has a very strong moral compass, and he's willing to stick it out until he has freedom on his terms, not on the terms of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we will stay tuned. It's certainly an interesting story. And regardless of what the resolution is, we'll be happy to have you back in when we get a bit closer as well.
Yeah, and people can, get Boston Magazine. It's the September issue, or they can go on to bostonmagazine.com today and read the article for free and get involved with this case. That's, the groundswell of support. I'm doing interviews like this just to build up a community that is outraged as the community that is defending Karen Read right now.
Do you think it might lead to some kind of cascade effect if this does actually go through? Some other people you think out there that would be maybe thrown into a whirlwind of whether or not they really did it?
Sure. I mean, there are thousands of prisoners across the United States who are serving time for crimes they didn't commit. I'm one person and I can't do it myself, but you've got the Innocence Projects and all these other organizations that look at judicial corruption, law enforcement corruption. And I think that prior to the Karen Read case, people were always saying, well, we do believe law enforcement. And don't get me wrong, I've got, great friends in law enforcement, but there are dirty, rotten apples in every barrel, primarily in law enforcement. And it's about exposing them and getting to the truth.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Casey, for joining me for this conversation. It has been a pleasure, as always.
Always a pleasure for me, Grady. Thank you so much.
I'm Grady Collane, and thank you for listening. I'm Grady Collane in the CapeCod.com News Center.